Good afternoon and welcome to our webinar, Risk Management for Higher Education Governance. I am Emily Ansonek, Assistant Director of Programs at AGB. Thank you for that pause. On your screen, most likely on the right, you should see GoToWebinar's control panel. You can use this panel to interact with us. There are two ways you can listen to the audio, via phone or through your electronic device. If you are listening through your computer, tablet, or smartphone, you will see the mic and speakers option is selected. Should you want to listen on a traditional telephone, please select the phone option and the call-in information will be displayed. Please note that due to the number of attendees on the webinar, all participants have been muted. If you would like to ask us a question, please type it in the questions box and click send. The moderator will be reviewing questions as they come in throughout the presentation, so please pose them as they occur. If we are unable to respond to your question during the presentation, we will be sure to reach out to you afterwards via email to respond. If you would like to hide your control panel, simply click the orange arrow and it will be minimized to the top right of your screen. I am pleased to pass the mic over to our moderator today, Doug Goldenberg-Hart, Director of AGB Press, to introduce himself and our speakers on this important topic.
Good afternoon, everyone. We've got two speakers today from United Educators, Janice Abraham, who's President and CEO of United Educators Insurance, which is a reciprocal risk retention group. UE is the premier risk management and liability insurance expert serving educational institutions, offering in-depth expertise on the unique risks and claims facing education. Prior to joining UE, Abraham served the higher education community as the Chief Financial Officer and Treasurer at Whitman College, and in positions at Cornell University and the National Association of College and University Business Officers, or NACUBO. Abraham also served as an international banker for JP Morgan. She's a trustee at American University and Whitman College, a director of the Campagna Center, the Griffin Foundation, the Institute's Board, and the American Property and Casualty Insurance Association, and a member of the American University School of International Service Dean's Advisory Council. She's also on AGB's editorial board for our magazine, Trusteeship. She's a former president of the Western Association of College and University Business Officers and a past member of the board of directors of NACUBO and the National Risk Retention Association. Joining Janice is Sarah Brogler. Sarah is an attorney and associate vice president for risk management at UE, where she oversees consulting services, risk research, and online program development, deployment, and support. Previously, she was Associate Vice President and Associate General Counsel for Resolutions Management at UE, managing lawyers and claims professionals resolving liability insurance claims for UE members. Prior to beginning her work at UE, she was a staff attorney at the Kentucky Community and Technical College System. Welcome, Janice and Sarah.
Thanks. It's great to be here. We appreciate it, Doug. Let's get started right away because Sarah and I, this is Janice Abraham, have a lot to cover, and we want to make sure we do have time for questions that may come up over the hour we have together. Today we want to cover three primary areas on enterprise risk management, focusing on governing boards and senior leadership. We're going to do a little bit of a foundation so that we are all talking the same language. And what is ERM fundamentals? Some common definitions, the current thinking around ERM. There's been a lot of progress on ERM over the past, 20 years in the higher education arena. It began very much so at the turn of the century, gained momentum in 2008, 2009 after the global financial crisis. And we have witnessed in talking and doing some research for the AGB book, a lot of maturity within the ERM programs at public and private institutions, and want to share with what your peers, your colleagues are doing at different institutions. And we also have hot off the press new surveys on top risks, both from AGB and United Educators. What kinds of risks are we facing in higher education? But first, let me start with some common definitions. Clearly, risk is omnipresent, and we are not here today, and nor will we ever be talking about eliminating risk. In fact, we see risk as something that should be embraced. It can be both a threat, yes, there are downsides when risk occurs on the horizon and confronts educational institutions, but we also want everyone to embrace risk as an opportunity, something that there are upsides associated with. So a broad definition that the general industry uses of risk is really the effect of uncertainty on your objectives. We all have strategic plans, we have objectives, we have goals. Risk is what plays to the uncertainty, but it is very much upside as well as downside. And so we shouldn't just think of risks as what will, an external event that will cause us harm. There are risks that higher education can and should take advantage of, and in our view, now more than ever. So it's really anything that could harm, prevent, delay, or enhance your ability to achieve your objectives. So that's the framework we're going to use to think about risk in the ERM framework. There's been very much an evolution. I won't go so far as to say it's a revolution in ERM and all of risk management, but there has been an evolution as we think about risk management in higher education. It very much started when I began my career at Cornell and later at Whitman. Risk was pretty much transactional. It was reacting to things. It was about transferring risk, about buying insurance, about really seeing a very specific defined risk and trying to buy insurance for it. And it was very much in the reactionary mode. Oh my goodness, I could have a fire, I could have a windstorm, I could get sued. What do I do about it? And that continues. There continues to be thinking along those, but what we've seen on campuses, it's been much more integrated into the fabric of the campus. And by that we mean risk is an expense, and that we witness that primarily as we think about compliance. There is a lot of focus over the past 10 years. Higher education, as everyone on the call knows, is a highly regulated industry, probably second to utilities, I would say, for the regulations that we have to comply with. And there's been a focus on compliance as a risk, the compliance function. It has been very much audit driven. In many cases, audit committees are the ones that control the risk. That's where the reports come up to on risk, both transactional as well as compliance issues. And so it became more integrated into the workings of the university or college, moving beyond transactional. And what we are seeing in the more mature models, the more sophisticated campuses who have been thinking about enterprise risk management over the past 10 years in a very deliberate manner, is risk is uncertainty, and it's focusing on optimizing the goals and the events that can happen, meaning it is much more strategic than it has been in the past. And so this evolution of risk from transactional to integrated to strategic, and how can risk help me accomplish my goals, upside and downside, is where we see risk going and really maturing into enterprise risk management. So, in 2013, actually a couple years before then, AGB came to United Educators and said, we really need some help on thinking about the role of governing boards in risk management, and what is this ERM thing, United Educators, and how do we help boards think about it? So I wrote a book that was published by AGB in 2013, and recently AGB came back to us and said, things have really changed. We're getting a lot of questions on it. Can you do a second edition? And of course we said yes, and Sarah joined me with Lisa Kavanova and Justin Collinger, and the four of us put to pen to paper and updated the research and did a new edition, a second edition of this book. It will be out in time for the annual conference for AGB in National Harbor in April, and the book will be out in March of 2020. So this really is, I think, a milestone in higher education and how we as a community think about ERM and trying to document some of the changes. What was interesting, and I see this as a trustee as well as a co-author on this book, is what has changed so dramatically since the first edition of the book. And of course, the first, and it's on all of our minds, is the demographic shifts that have occurred to date, but more importantly, what we all anticipate based on high school graduations, births, and the demographic studies that are being done that will be upon us in 2025, 2026. So the question is, who are our students? The shrinking traditional students, particularly if you happen to be in the Midwest or the New England area, the Mid-Atlantic regions, the traditional students are clearly shifting. The shift in graduate education, credentialing. So the demographic shifts are probably the most glaring issue of what's changing on campus. The role of technology, and I mean this both from a risk component as well as how we learn, how we distribute learning. We look at the fastest growing institutions in this country, whether or not it's Western Governors or Liberty University or Arizona State, Southern University of New Hampshire. Technology plays a very key part in how they deliver the learning and how students partake in the learning. So technology, both from a cyber risk factor as well as a distribution and learning factor, are tremendous shifts that have accelerated over the past 5 years. I don't need to say a lot about the scandals that have plagued higher education. We all read the newspapers and we know what has happened from Penn State and Michigan State and USC, and the list unfortunately goes on. So these scandals are real. They're huge opportunity costs and cause great damage both to the individuals, most importantly involved, as well as to the campuses. Another factor that's changed a lot is the expanding social and economic divide. We all care very much, I think, about access and quality, but how do we address that? What does it mean? And both globally, within the United States, and then on our campuses. We've seen a significant shift in the needs of employers, the role of credentialing, of what individual companies need. Some of these companies are partnering with institutions, some of that I've just mentioned, and others are going on their own and developing professional development, executive development, specific skill development. And so that's a big shift. The global competition is significantly different than it was 10 years ago, and I think it's easy to chart the number of international students, both at an undergraduate and a graduate level, that is plateauing and declining. And there are institutions that have always been great outside of the United States, and they're getting better and better and being active competitors with us. Unfortunately, the one thing that hasn't changed as much as I think we all would want it to is the reluctance of educational institutions, and I include boards. I'm a trustee at 2 institutions, as Doug mentioned, is our reluctance to adapt. There's some benefits to that because these are precious institutions that have survived for centuries, but at the same time, this reluctance to adapt, I think, is increasing the risk profile of our institutions as the above factors really come into play.
Thanks, Janice. I'll take it from here. Sarah Brockler here. As Janice just described, the risks of today are different. They're more complex, they're interrelated, and as a result, leadership engagement is increasingly important. ERM provides a framework for that oversight. So why ERM? Regardless of the type of risk to be addressed, an ERM program can help address it. Institutions should engage in ERM to improve their sustainability, their preparedness, their strategic planning, their internal controls, and their proactivity. Ultimately, ERM helps further institutional mission. Administrators who have implemented ERM describe their experience to us at United Educators as improving all of these factors. In fact, a common refrain is that ERM provides peace of mind. Increasingly at UE, we are focused on ERM because we found that it is an effective vehicle for our members to engage leadership in creating a discipline and setting a tone from the highest levels of the institution about the benefits of risk management. It's a call to action on the part of boards and leadership to engage in institutional risk management. Janice mentioned setting a baseline, and I want to do that here to provide a level set about what we mean when we talk about ERM. It's an institution-wide analysis of risks, both upside and downside, as Janice described, that if not mitigated or embraced, could impede or impair the educational mission. And in our work at UE, we use this definition for the ERM process. We find it's not too corporate, so it speaks to the unique perspective that educational institutions, as mission-driven, have about risk management. ERM is a collaborative process that is, and this is a key point, led by senior leadership to identify, assess, plan for, and monitor risks. Those are 4 steps. It's continuous and repeatable that could occur at regular intervals of a quarter, semi-annually, or yearly. And although senior leadership drives the action, the board is involved and reviews reports on high-level risks, asks questions, may even request that the school adopt an ERM process. In fact, if we advance to the next slide, you'll see that in our view, ERM starts at the top. Without support and a mandate, ERM cannot succeed. That means the board and president have a big role to play in holding everyone else accountable for participation. And Janice, I know you have views on this from your conversations with UE members.
Yeah, it's really important to make sure that boards and presidents, chancellors believe in this process and believe that there's a value in it. It's interesting to think that the first prompt that we received on ERM came from AGB. It didn't come from ACE or NACUBA or any of the other associations serving higher education. It was AGB that came because it was the boards that heard about ERM because they serve, the trustees, because they serve on bank boards and corporate boards, and in their business lives come to the trustee role with the framework of enterprise risk management. Publicly traded companies have been embracing this for quite a while, really, but long before the turn of the century. It was almost an outgrowth of Sarbanes-Oxley. And so this is something that boards need to believe in and ask about. But it's also really important, we found in our research, that boards, that expression that so many of us have heard, should be noses in and fingers out on this. That is, they should be asking hard questions, holding people accountable, but at the same time, not doing the ERM process.
So we emphasize that although ERM is led by senior leadership, board oversight is imperative. But about the senior administrators, so these are the administrators that have oversight of ERM. They set the strategic approach, they maintain accountability, and for working together to identify and address the risks that are going to fall between gaps or within silos or other functional units. And while senior leadership might be accountable for ERM, the responsibility for implementing change falls to risk owners and task owners completing the pyramid. So these are people who deliver on organizational mission in a day-to-day way and must navigate uncertainty and risk on a daily basis.
Yeah, we've seen committees formed at the ERM committees at the senior administration level, at the risk owner level, and at the task owner level. And that really is the culture of the institution, who should be involved. But reporting up to the trustees on, 5 or 10 risks that the administration is owning, there's every reason to think that a complex university will have many, many risks. But as the pyramid gets smaller, gets more narrow, then the risks that are actually being tracked A, increase in importance, and B, become fewer. And so that task owners will have a broader list of risk as it moves up the pyramid.
So we keep talking about risk and risks and what's facing education. And United Educators conducted a survey that I'd like to share with you now that talks about today's risks. This is an annual survey completed by senior campus leaders, often CFOs, HR directors, risk managers, whoever the primary risk contact is at an institution. And we use it at United Educators to look for trends so we can better understand and inform our membership. I will note respondents to the survey are permitted to select more than one category, so you'll see the numbers do not total 100%. This year's higher ed results, which will be published to our membership this week, in fact, reflect three broad themes, and I'll touch on each of them briefly. First, the business model, which dominated the top 5 risks. These categories included enrollment, operational pressures, and funding, and these categories dwarfed all others, with admissions and retention being selected twice as frequently as the next most selected risk. Why? Janice talked about this earlier. Shifting demographics, declining state support, and competition from new providers are serious risks for colleges and universities. If you follow the higher ed press as we do, you may have seen a June 2019 article in Inside Higher Education that listed 20 institutions that have closed since 2016. This is an issue that's impacted higher ed unevenly, primarily affecting small private colleges, but we assume that the boards and administrations of most institutions are thinking long and hard about financial stability. Second broad theme I'll highlight is sexual misconduct. And that's a broad category of risk that concerns our members in different ways. What began as Obama-era regulatory guidance was expanded into the culture by priest abuse in the Catholic Church, the Me Too movement, and high-profile scandals involving doctors and coaches. Recently, several states have enacted so-called reviver statutes, which extend civil statutes of limitation for sexual offenses to give victims more chance for redress. And similar legislation is pending in many other states. The claims themselves that we see at United Educators have evolved too, from student-on-student sexual assault to faculty or coach or doctor on student, and in the case of serial sexual predators, many students affected. And third, the third theme I'll highlight here is safety and security. And this is an evergreen topic of higher education risk management that is augmented by the fact that the campuses of today are big, they're geographically dispersed, and that creates challenges to centralized oversight. Maintenance and repair of aging buildings and infrastructure requires effective planning and execution. And it's not just the tangible bricks and mortar facilities that present risk. Data and cybersecurity risks are increasingly prevalent as more and more of our lives take place using technology. Doug, I think AGB had similar findings in AGB's survey, and I'll let you speak to those.
Yeah, thank you, Sarah. AGB has just finished the 2020 AGB Trustee Index, which surveys trustees as opposed to senior leaders or officers at colleges and universities. And in our survey, which will be out next week, we constrained people to choosing one topic as the highest area of concern for them. So these do total to 100. And what you see on the slide here is reported from public institution trustees. When we looked at the private institution trustees, the priorities realigned somewhat, and the third one here, decrease in state funding, drops to the bottom of the list, not surprisingly. But you can see that across those two lists, internally we know there's a lot of overlap between these two lists, and they very much dovetail with the priorities that Sarah was pointing out that comes from the membership of UE, the college business officers. But you can see there's a few other things that creep in that are affecting trustees more than officers. Things like the public perception of the value of a college degree, student debt, and concern about students' preparedness for college.
Yeah, one of the changes in the second edition of the book that we focused on, because ERM has been part of the fabric of higher education, as I noted, since really the turn of the century, is we wanted to give some deeper view of the maturity of ERM at different campuses. There are many institutions, and we talked to a lot of them, are just beginning to get started on this. Some have been working at it for a while, and some are extremely sophisticated and really have put ERM into the DNA of the institution. And so we categorize these types of institutions in low, medium, and high maturity. And so it might be worthwhile for the participants on the phone, for our colleagues to look and say, honestly, in all candor, where are we on this? Is this something driven almost exclusively by the risk management department? Is it pretty much ad hoc? And there are a couple passionate folks there, but it's really a reactionary mode that something happens and some folks run around and what would we do? How would we respond to this? So it is much more, I don't want to say pulling teeth, but it's really not ingrained into it, driven by some personalities, primarily focused in the risk management department, and much more ad hoc. And that's a low maturity or an ERM model that is just starting off. Where the majority of campuses are, since we've been at this for a while, is at the medium maturity. So it really is something that institutional leaders believe in, and they see it as a necessary function. Sarah outlined the 4 steps of ERM: identification of the risks, assessment of the risks. Step 3 is actually doing something, developing a plan, and then the 4th step of monitoring and communicating that. So those 4 steps are regularly done. There's a process that's done. Risk management is done throughout the campus. Accountability is okay-ish, but not really as in the job description of those who are being held or should be held accountable. That seems to be where most of the campuses are right now, in that medium basis. What we advocate, what we encourage, and where a few institutions are, is the high maturity model, and that is institutions are very focused on strategic risks. Things are debated, the risks are identified, the opportunities identified before new programs are put in. It is very much accountable, those who are involved, so the provost, vice president for campus life or student affairs, CFO. These individuals are held accountable for the risks that are identified in their area. There is a very much risk-aware culture, and so there's a constant scanning of peers, of the environment, and very important that we didn't see in the others is there's a gap analysis, that there is an ability to look in between the lines. We all know higher education, for the most part, is very siloed. And we are decentralized, complex organizations. Even small liberal arts colleges are decentralized and siloed. I serve as a trustee at one, and I work with large, complex research institutions. And so the mature ERM programs mind the gap. They look between the silos, because if we look back on the huge risks, those scandals and other issues, these are not just a straight line of authority. They are where, yes, somebody is held accountable for it, but equally important, the leadership is talking across the silos, across the different departments and areas of responsibilities. And so this ERM maturity model, which we believe is aspirational for most, a reality for some, and an area where we hope both the book as well as these ongoing discussions will guide more institutions too.
And before we move on, I want to make a note for UE members on the line that United Educators published just yesterday to the membership a tool based on the maturity model that can help you assess where you are in the maturity process.
I just wanted to jump in for a second. We have a question that I wanted to pose since it's germane to what you guys were just talking about. One of our attendees is asking, can you share some peers who have high maturity programs in your opinion?
We have some, probably without their permission, would probably rather not go forward with it, but it's a good idea, and maybe we can go back and get their permission and then do a supplemental sharing with AGB and the UE members in order to update on that. But rather than get out there ahead of them, because many of them talk to us and share their models in confidence, and private institutions particularly tend to pursue this in different ways. We are a sharing culture in higher education, but I'd rather not get out ahead of it. So it's a good question, a fair question, but let's circle back and get to those institutions before we come forward.
Yeah, and I think to the questioner, thanks for the segue, because I think what might be helpful next is to turn to a couple of samples that we've included here to discuss that are drawn from those interviews that Justin and Lisa in particular, our colleagues here at United Educators, found in conversations with our members to update the book.
Well, let me jump in as well, Sarah, in that we listed those 4 steps: identification, assessment, develop a plan, and monitor and communicate. We found in our research that institutions are spending way too much time in the identification of risks and not enough time in actually developing responses to those risks and opportunities. And so part of the goal in writing the book and sharing this today is to give you risk registers, lists of risk at institutions. We didn't make these up. This is what institutions are working with, particularly those on the mature side, and so that we can try to jumpstart step 1 and move to step 2 and 3 in the process, and not use up a lot of energy and social capital, political capital in developing the risks. Institutions are similar enough that these risk registers that we're going to share with you now, I think it's probably safe enough you could pick 5 from any of these risks and then begin to work on implementation plans and assessments from this rather than starting with a blank slate of paper. So Sarah, do you want to review this risk register?
Right. This is the image in front of you is a sample university risk register. It's in essence a priority list of top risks specific to a given institution, compiled by a cross-functional group of senior leaders with involvement of the board. It's a simple starter step along the continuum of ERM maturity, but it reflects some strategic thinking and planning, which is really the essence of ERM. In fact, we see many institutions begin their ERM journey with this type of basic risk register, and it can actually be pretty effective at initiating action. With ERM, UE suggests tilting the bias toward action, as Janice just advocated, with a flip of the 80-20 rule. So that is, we discourage institutions from getting bogged down in the planning and devote about 20% of ERM effort to planning with 80% to execution.
So after, if you remember, the first step was identification of the risk. The second is, what should we be spending our energy on? What has the most likelihood of it happening to our institution, and what would it do? What's the severity function? And this is a pretty simple heat map. I've seen them extremely complex. I think there's a direct correlation with how much money one spends with outside consultants to make it very complex. But this is a pretty simple. These are the top risks that the campus identified, both with board input and campus input. And then they began to rank them. And obviously, we've all seen these heat maps. The red upper right-hand corner are the ones that they want to put energy in to initially. So this campus, in our view, should focus on the crisis management, the financial model, compliance, and information technology. And those will be where most of the energy the first year. Reputation, some campuses keep that reputational risk management. We've done a lot of research and writing on that as a separate risk category. Others see it as an outgrowth if something else occurs and drives the reputational risk upward or downward. So this is, there are different heat maps that you'll see, but the idea is to say, okay, board, we've identified maybe 10 things we want to focus on. What are we going to do first, second, third? And then every year update that list, step 4, in order to determine what we should be working on. But here's one example. In this case, we were a little surprised to see crisis management at that high of an issue, thinking that most campuses have addressed this, but there are some who need to continue to update how they're going to respond to a crisis, whether it's a natural catastrophe or a human-made crisis, and how resilient the campus is in that. So this was a private university, developed their top 10 risks, and then began to chart them out and move forward from there. This slide actually came from the University of Vermont. I particularly like this one because it talks about upside and downside risks. Obviously, the green are the areas where the risk would be targeted because they believe there's a way for the university to take advantage and to enhance its mission, to strengthen its mission. The darker the color, the more senior the leadership is that's focused on it. But it also speaks to an earlier point Sarah made, is that the facilities department would potentially have a list of risks. They would be perhaps a lighter color of risks and opportunities and have identification, frequency and severity, or an assessment, and then develop a plan and then monitor them. So this is a model, and UVM is an example of a mature model that has been working on it, sees upside and downside risks, and is able to have it permeate with a sense of accountability and ownership throughout the entire campus.
So this final model of a risk register by the National Association of College and University Business Officers, NACUBO, is a sophisticated example of a mechanism that not only identifies specific risks, but goes several steps further. It also color codes actions needed to manage each risk. It has arrows showing how the institution is managing the risk directionally. It identifies the strategic objective for the institution associated with the risk. It links dependent or interrelated risks. It names who within the campus leadership owns the risk. And finally, it states the board committee tasked with oversight of the risk. And Janice, I think that's something that's evolved since the publication of the first book, is the board committee oversight.
Yeah, I think you're right, Sarah. We initially put in the book because we believe that different board committees should have ownership of the cognizant risks. So student mental health and the health and well-being of students logically resides with the Campus Life or Student Life Committee. Many campuses started with ERM being the ownership or oversight of the audit committee. And there are still some campuses, in fact, I'm going to a campus in a couple weeks, where ERM is still the purview of the audit committee. We encourage more mature models to recognize that the audit committee should have oversight of the ERM process, just like they have oversight of internal audit. But the individual committees, academic affairs, development, governance, should have a role in monitoring the progress made of the risks, upside and downside risks that have been identified through this strategic process. So in this committee, in this NACUBO example, acknowledges that yes, audit committee does have risks, but not all risks are audit committee risks. But we're still seeing an awful lot who are, the audit committee is holding on to ERM oftentimes with relish, shall I say.
Yeah, and you know what's interesting? If you look at the NACUBO example, you'll see enrollment, tuition dependence, and some of the other risks that we've touched on today from the AGB and UE surveys represented here. And you'll also see that this mock institution in the NACUBO example has coded its top risk as needing critical action, but moving in the right direction with the up arrow to meet the strategic objectives of maintaining a strong reputation and financial stability. And they've linked that particular risk to nearly every other risk, and vested responsibility for it with the provost and the vice president of enrollment. And then further to Janice's point on the board, it's the enrollment and marketing committee who will manage this risk.
And in summary, our research indicates that successful ERM programs, mature programs that are having a significant impact on the strategic health, the flexibility, the nimbleness, the responsiveness of the campus, have the following, and that is ERM's part of the culture. It's not a one and done initiative. It really is something that is part of the fabric, the DNA, the culture of the institution. It is very much linked to the mission, vision, and values, that it accepts risks. And I note about having a risk appetite. Some higher education as a whole, in our view, is pretty risk adverse. Now, faculty take great risks in their research and their discipline. Lord knows students take immense risks in their activities. But as institutions, we are a fairly risk adverse environment. But I think the conversation of what is our risk appetite, that happens in the investment committee. I happen to chair one investment committee and sit on another investment committee. So we get risk when it comes to endowment investing, but I think it's something that the rest of the community has not had robust discussions on. So having a discussion on risk appetite, how much are we willing to lose? What are we willing to put out there? We have no risk tolerance for student health and safety, but we do have risk tolerance for a new program, a new degree, a new collaboration, a new partnership. And ERM can help articulate that and provide some comfort and muscle memory behind taking advantage of that. It is critically important for the senior leadership to have a buy-in on this. If the board doesn't care about ERM, we have not seen any institution that had a mature model if the board didn't care. It simply doesn't exist. And so having the board have more than one or two champions believe in ERM as a structure to advance the institution. Very important to have the president's cabinet own these risks, be held accountable for them, which is why we like to see them linked to the committees that the provost, vice president for student life, campus affairs, goes to his or her committee and makes the presentation. So that's important to have that ownership link. We think it's very important, and the mature models have a risk analysis for new initiatives, new programs, new degrees, new credentials, new partnerships, so that there's a framework. The board can look, okay, we want to do this. What's the upside? What's the downside? What's the likelihood this is going to happen? What are we going to do to mitigate? How are we going to see that it's going south early so we can step in and mediate, mitigate it? And so there's a risk analysis associated with new programs and projects. And it's talked about. The most robust programs in ERM are those, the public institutions, they're on their websites. I think the University of Texas is a leader in this area, but there are many other institutions that are very happy to share what they've done so far. The private institutions, they talk about it within their own community. A little less likely to want to share their top risks and what they're doing, and I understand that culture as well, but it is communicated that we are talking about this, we care about these issues, we're responsive, and it matters to us that we are assessing our risks, trying to seize our opportunities, and advance the institution in a pretty tumultuous world. So we're happy to entertain any questions that you have. We will be at the upcoming conference, the AGB conference, and we're also looking forward to having the AGB publish the book and disseminate more of these ideas. Doug, any questions that have come in?
Yeah, terrific. Thank you guys so much. We do have some questions that have come in, I'm just going to read out what I've got here and let you guys address them as you can. Can you first, we have an attendee who's asking, can you talk about the perceived risk of discussing enterprise risks in a public board meeting?
That's a great question. And I'll take a first stab at this, and then my lawyer colleague will jump in. And I'll say this because I'm not a lawyer, but people often ask us, my goodness, if we come up with these risks and we expose them, aren't we creating more liability for ourselves? And our retort to that is, yes, if you do nothing else. So if you identify these risks in a public setting, in an open setting, and then ignore them, walk away, don't develop a plan, come back 2 years later and they're still there, then yes, we believe that you are creating additional risk, additional liability for the institution. But by identifying risks and following through and asking questions in a public setting, we believe you're actually creating a safer environment, a healthier environment, and an environment that is more responsive to the evolving needs of higher education. Now, counsel, do you add to that?
I don't have a whole lot else to add, except that I expect the question asker is attuned to the fact that public institutions will have obligations to respond to open records requests. And so even if the risk information isn't available on a website, it's certainly subject to public disclosure under sunshine laws. So I think that the arguments Janice made in favor of transparency probably hold sway, whether you're public or private, but obviously publics have an additional obligation to make clear what they're doing to the public.
Yeah, we have found the more mature models are those that acknowledge those risks, acknowledge that they're working on them, use it as an education tool for alumni, for students, for prospective students, for community members, that, you know, that there are some people, I mean, we live in the demographic cliff environment. There are an awful lot of individuals who don't understand that. And so talking about this and being upfront about it, we believe creates a stronger, more resilient institution that is willing to be as transparent as possible in order to address these.
We've got a follow-up question to the risk register slide from NACUBO, so I want to back up to that. Is the risk register for NACUBO rated according to impact and probability?
Oh, that's a good question. And I don't know the answer to that, except the risk ID and the ranking feels to me that it is, that came from an impact financial, that it feels as though as we look at these and we look at AGB's list, we look at United Educators list, that these would be ranking, the top 5 would be the top 5 that they should be paying attention to. So I can't answer it definitively, but my educated assumption is that yes, undergraduate and graduate enrollment, tuition dependency, fundraising, alternative revenue, often claimed, described as diversification of revenue. I hear that a lot at public institutions particularly. We have 2 revenue sources. We need more, meaning public support and tuition. So my sense is that these are probably ranked in the top priority for the institution, but we'd need to circle back to NACUBO to see. Again, I think this is an example. The others are real-life campuses that shared them with us. This is an actual a mock-up of how NACUBO is advocating its membership to think about ERM.
And if you come away from this webinar with one impression, I think we hope it would be that there is no wrong answer to how an ERM program is measured or tracked. It's entirely customizable according to the institution's needs and objectives. So if you wanted to construct a model that took those factors into account, that would be great.
We've got a follow-up question about the heat maps. Are you seeing heat maps that incorporate an element of velocity?
Yeah, we are actually, and I think the first one I ever saw on that was Dartmouth used velocity. How quickly is it coming? Some of these are 5 years away, and I think the demographic cliff is probably the most obvious one, and some are imminent. Our crisis plan is weak, and that's an imminent. So yes, there's a third dimension that a lot of campuses are now using. It could be in the impact severity, but often it's with an x-axis, a y-axis, and it's really the third dimension is velocity. And so we are seeing campuses. That would be more logical in a more mature model. After you develop a simple risk register and begin to develop responses to that is what should we deal with? And is it imminent, or do we have some time to think about it? So we need to find new partnerships for credentialing. We need to work with technology, and are we going to develop this ourselves, or are we going to do a partner with an OPM, for example? So I think the velocity, speed, duration of the risk is something that more and more campuses who have been at it for a while are thinking. We believe it adds a level of complexity for a low maturity model that might be hard to think about, but if you've been at this for a while, you really may want to think about the speed of the risk or opportunity coming on, acknowledging that it feels to me that there's an acceleration of many of these, but clearly high school graduation is a pretty easy one to track. Demographers have by public schools, parochial schools, private institutions, high school graduations. I mean, that's a pretty clear analysis and that's a perfect example of velocity and how it factors into risk.
We have a question about whether or not ERM travels well outside of the United States. Have you found these models to be applicable to institutions located outside the U.S.?
I think the basic model could. I believe Australian institutions have been thinking about this and doing some work on that. We've heard a little bit about this with some Canadian institutions. Actually, the University of Alberta, and it's included as a slide as an example in the book, we think has one of the most sophisticated ERM models, and they've been at it for a couple decades. So Canadian institutions have been doing this for a while. I learned a lot from the University of Alberta model. And so there's no reason it couldn't be adapted to other institutions, and the Canadian institutions, and to a lesser extent, the Australian institutions have been working on this model for the same reasons that American institutions are.
And just as a follow-up.
Yeah, okay.
This is a follow-up. Can you think of any examples in, for instance, Mexico?
Yeah, I do not know of any in Mexico. It doesn't mean it doesn't exist, but I do not know of any in the higher education system in Mexico.
Our next question is sort of getting at the difference between public institutions and smaller privates. For smaller institutions, isn't it more likely that board members with strong business backgrounds will have more ERM expertise than the college administrators they're dealing with, and therefore may need to be more proactive about ERM than trustees in larger institutions?
That's an interesting question, but I'm not sure I agree with that, because we've been at ERM in higher education for quite a while now. There's been a lot written on it. Obviously, a second edition of a book is coming out. Institutions have been practicing it for a while. And I think it is important for institutions to carve out a space how ERM in the corporate world is different than ERM in the higher education world. We do not, in higher education, measure all risks from a financial perspective. But much of the risks in corporate America and publicly traded or commercial enterprises, the risk can be quantified, is a financial risk associated with it. You can buy reputational risk insurance for publicly traded companies, for commercial companies. That doesn't exist. because the reputation is a much more complex and a different component for higher education. So I think it is important for higher education to describe its own space, its mission, its values, its risk appetite that is separate from the corporate world. Again, there are many ways that it got started in the corporate world, but I think we at our peril in higher education only follow the corporate ERM model. The corporate ERM model has ERM housed exclusively in the audit committee. We noted before, we don't think that's a best practice in higher education because our risks, Title IX, sexual assault, those issues are not monetary issues. Those are mission, health, safety, different kinds of risks and issues for us. So there are levels of, I serve at an R2 institution, a liberal arts institutions. The level of the board sophistication is exceptionally high at both of those. We talk, Sarah and I, at many large public university boards, small research institutions, and the level of sophistication at the governing boards is extremely high. So I wouldn't categorize it with that. I think the overarching issue is we in higher education need to own ERM for our culture, our differences, and not, yes, it has rooted in corporate America, but I think we fail our mission and what our values are if we don't make it our own, talk about it in our own language, and have it embedded in our culture. Yes, there's an opportunity to use it, but those general counsels and CFOs, risk managers that had ERM follow a tight corporate model ended up complaining to us privately that everything is quantified. Every risk has a number associated with it. And we don't believe that's the reality of higher education. We don't believe all risks are quantifiable. And I think there's a danger of following the corporate model in lockstep rather than making it our own to reflect our culture and our values.
Wonderful. Thank you so much.
All right, so thank you everyone for the abundance of questions. We're actually unable to address them, all of them, due to time constraints, but someone from UE or AGB will be able to follow up with you directly and answer those questions for you. Thank you again. But thank you everyone for participating in today's webinar. We hope you found the information shared valuable. And as a reminder to all attendees, you will receive an email from AGB within 48 hours with the recording of this webinar. Be sure to complete the brief evaluation included in that email to share your thoughts and feedback on today's webinar. Also, just wanted to make you aware of some upcoming events we have. The Foundation Leadership Forum next week, the workshop for board professionals in the national conference, which both Janice and Sarah mentioned. So I want to thank everyone for coming. Janice, Sarah, Doug, do you have any parting words before we end out the webinar?
I just wanted to quickly thank Sarah and Janice for a very illuminating hour. I think that attendees probably got a whole lot out of it, and I just want to remind everyone that there is a second edition of the Risk Management book coming out in March, and if that's piqued your interest, then you should see that on the AGB website in the next 6 weeks.
Thank you for the opportunity.
Thanks very much.
Great. All right, well, thank you everyone for attending, and we hope you have a great rest of your day.
All right, thank you.